Your fence is 6 inches over the line, and until you move it, the association is assessing $12 a day. That was Delia Frawley, president of the Stonecrest Meadows Homeowners Association, standing on my gravel with a clipboard pressed to her chest, reading a number off a form she had filled out in her own hand. The fence she meant ran along the south edge of my place, a 1/4 mile of cedar post and woven wire. I had set myself the summer my wife was still alive. The line she meant was a line she had drawn on a copy of a copy, and the property she was talking about was 40 acres my family had held under one recorded deed since before the subdivision behind me had a name. My name is Calvin Rourke. I am 62 years old, and for 31 years I worked as a licensed land surveyor for the county, and then on my own walking boundaries and reading the iron pins other men had driven into the ground a century before me. What Delia did not know, the morning she stood there reading me a daily fine, was that the man whose fence she wanted moved had spent his whole working life proving where lines actually fall, and that I had the original plat of her entire subdivision in a folder in my kitchen, with a recorded error in it that no one in Stonecrest Meadows had ever bothered to check. If a woman handed you a fine for a fence you knew stood exactly where it had stood for 20 years, on land that was yours before her houses existed, what would you have done? I did not argue with her. I want you to understand that from the start, because the whole shape of this thing depends on it. I have watched men lose good cases by opening their mouths at the wrong moment, and I had learned a long time ago that the quietest thing in any dispute is a recorded document, and that the quietest man usually wins. So I stood there with my coffee going cold in my hand, and I let her finish. $12 a day, she said again, in case I had missed it. It accrues, Mr. Rourke. It does not stop because you ignore it. I hear you, I said. That was all. There was nothing else worth spending. She wrote something on her clipboard the way a person writes when they want you to watch them write it, and she walked back to a white golf cart parked at the end of my drive with the association crest stuck to the side. She had on a coral blazer and white campus shoes, and the shoes were already gray with my dust, and she picked her way back across the gravel like the gravel had been put there to insult her. I watched the cart hum off down the county road toward the gate of her subdivision, and then I went inside, and I did the first thing I do with any piece of paper. A person hands me an anger. I wrote the date on it. I wrote the time. I put it in a folder. I had bought the folder years before for exactly this. It was a plain manila folder, and on the tab I had written one word in pencil, and the word was Stonecrest. Let me back up, because the fence is not where this started. It started with my grandfather, and then my father, and then me, on a piece of ground that runs from the county road up a long, shallow rise to a stand of oak. My grandfather would not let anyone cut 40 acres. My grandfather bought it in 1934, when the price of land in that part of the county was the price of a man's willingness to stay, and he recorded the deed himself at the courthouse, and the deed described the 40 acres by meets and bounds, by the old stone corner at the road and the iron pin at the oak, and the run of the creek along the west. That description has never changed. It is the same description on the deed in my folder today. My wife's name. We married late, both of us, and we had one daughter, and Ruth died of a cancer that took her in 14 months when our girl was 9. The girl's name is Hazel. She is 16 now, and at the time this all began, she was 15. And she is the reason I tell this, slowly, and without heat, because she watched the whole thing, and what I wanted her to learn from it was not how to be angry. It was how to be right and patient at the same time. Which is harder and which lasts longer? I built the south fence, the last good summer Ruth had. She sat in a lawn chair at the top of the rise with a hat on and watched me set posts, and she made me move the gate twice because she said the first 2 spots were ugly, and the 3rd spot is where it still hangs. I can still see her up there. She had a thermos of sweet tea between her feet and a paperback she never finished, and every time I tamped a post, she would call down some small correction. The post leaned a hair. The line wandered. The gate wanted to be where you could see the oak from it. I argued with her about the gate the way you argue with someone you have already decided to obey. The first spot, put it in a low place that held water. The second spot was fine by me, and ugly by her. The third spot, the one she pointed to with the paperback, framed the oak at the top of the rise dead center. And the morning I hung it, she clapped from her chair like I had done something. That fence is not just wire to me. The posts are cedar. I cut and peeled. The gate swings on hinges. I set in concrete. I mixed in a wheelbarrow with our girl handing me the trowel. I want that on the record, too. The subdivision came in the year after she died. Stonecrest Meadows. Somebody bought the old Pratt place that bordered my 40 on the south, 160 acres of pasture that had run cattle when I was a boy, and they platted it into 81 lots with a clubhouse and a retention pond they called a lake. The developer was a company, and the company had a name, and the name on the paperwork that mattered later was Frawley. Delia's husband, Glenn Frawley, ran the company that platted and built Stonecrest Meadows, and Delia ran the homeowners association that governed it. And for the first few years I thought of them, when I thought of them at all, as the people on the other side of my south fence. For a while it was nothing. A surveyor came through when they platted, a young man working fast for a flat fee, and he set his stakes and shot his line and went home, and I did not pay close attention because the work was on their side and not mine. That was my one mistake in this whole account, and I will own it. I should have walked their line when they ran it. I did not. I had just buried my wife, and I was teaching a 9-year-old to braid her own hair, and I let it go. The pins went in the ground and the houses went up, and a paved street curled along the back of the development, a stone's throw from my fence. And people moved into the houses, and some of them were fine, and some of them were the kind of people who buy a house next to 40 acres of working land, and are then surprised to learn that land works. The first letter came 3 years in. It was about my barn. The letter said the barn's metal roof did not conform to the community's approved palette of earth tone roofing materials, and requested that I bring it into compliance. The letter was signed by Delia Frawley, president. I read it twice to be sure I understood that the homeowners association of a subdivision I did not live in and had never joined was writing to me about the color of a roof on land their development did not touch. Then I wrote the date on it and the time, and I put it in the folder. On top of the deed, that was sheet number 1, the sheet that was already there the morning of the fine. I did not answer it. There was nothing in it that required an answer, because Delia Frawley had no more authority over my barn than she had over the weather. The barn letter was a Tuesday. I remember because Hazel had a school thing that night, and I was reading the letter while I waited for her to find her shoes, and she came in and read it over my shoulder the way kids do. And she said, "Can they do that?" And I said no. And she said, "Then why'd they send it?" And I have thought about that question for a long time, because it is the right question, and the answer to it is the whole story. They sent it because no one had ever made them check whether they could. The second letter came that fall. It was about brush pile I had stacked near the south fence to burn when the weather turned. and it called the brush pile an unsightly accumulation of debris visible from association common areas, and gave me 30 days to remove it. Signed, Delia Frawley, President. Date, time, folder. 2 sheets now. I burned the brush pile when the burn ban lifted, which was when I was always going to burn it. And I took a photograph of the clean ground afterward, with the date showing on the camera. And that went in the folder too. Not because I owed them the picture, but because a man who has spent his life in boundary disputes learns to photograph the ground. I should tell you what I had started doing by then because it matters at the end. Every time a letter came, I did 3 things. I dated it, I filed it, and I drove to the county courthouse and pulled one more piece of the public record on Stonecrest Meadows. The records room at the courthouse is in the basement, a long, fluorescent room with a counter and a clerk named Bonnie, who came to know me by the 2nd year and would have the plat books waiting on the table by the time I came down the stairs. I pulled the recorded plat. I pulled the developer's filings. I pulled the surveyor certificate. I pulled the chain of title on the Pratt place, and the corner records the county keeps in a separate set of ledgers most people never know exist. I did it slowly, a folder at a time, the way you eat a thing that is too big to eat at once. And I did not yet know what I was looking for. Bonnie asked me once why a man with no lot in that subdivision kept pulling its paper. And I told her the truth, that I had spent 31 years learning that the cheapest insurance against a bad neighbor is knowing his ground better than he does. She laughed and said I was the only person who ever came down there for fun. I did not tell her it was not fun. It was the slow assembling of a thing I could feel coming, but could not yet name. I only knew that when people start sending you letters about your own land, the smart thing is to learn more about their land than they know themselves. By the 4th year, the letters had a rhythm. A day and a time. At the top, an offense. In the middle, a signature. At the bottom, my woodpile. My tractor parked where it could be seen. A trailer. A flag, each one signed by Delia. Each one dated and filed. I want you to feel the count building the way I felt it because the count is the case. By the spring of the 5th year, I had 9 letters in the folder, 9 separate assertions of authority over land that was not theirs, and not one of them had I answered with anything but a date stamp and a photograph. Then came the fence. The fence was different, and I knew it was different the morning Delia stood on my gravel, because the fence came with a number that ran the roof. The brush, the woodpile, those were demands. The fence was a meter. $12 a day, she said, accruing. And that told me something had changed on their side, that somebody had decided to stop sending letters and start building a balance. And that meant somebody intended to collect. A demand you can ignore, a debt they will try to attach to your land. I understood, standing there with my cold coffee, that the fight had finally arrived, and I was almost relieved, because I had been getting ready for it for 5 years, without admitting that was what I was doing. That afternoon I drove to the courthouse and I pulled the one document I had been circling without touching. The original recorded plat of Stonecrest Meadows, the master survey, the whole subdivision was platted from, the document, every lot line, and every easement, and every common area in that development, traced back to. This time I laid it on the long table in the records room, and I put my own deed beside it, and I put the county's official corner records beside both, and I read all 3, the way I had read 1,000 boundary disputes, looking not for what I wanted, but for what was actually there. It was there. It had been there the whole time. The surveyor who platted Stonecrest Meadows, the young man working fast for a flat fee, had tied his entire subdivision to the wrong corner. The deed to the Pratt place, the 160 acres the development sat on, called for its north boundary to begin at the original stone corner my grandfather had recorded in 1934, the same corner my 40 acres was tied to, the corner at the county road. The young surveyor had not found my grandfather's stone. He had found a different iron pin, an old fence corner set decades later and never recorded, sitting some 60 feet north of the true corner, and he had called that his point of beginning. He had platted the whole subdivision from a starting point 60 feet north of where the law said it began. I sat in that quiet room for a long time. I am going to tell you exactly what that error meant, because it is the hinge of everything that came after, and I am going to tell it the way I would tell a county judge, which is plainly. When you plat a subdivision from a point of beginning that is 60 feet off, you do not just move one line, you move every line. The error rolls through the whole plat. It meant that the development's recorded north boundary, the line Delia said my fence crossed, did not sit where their plat claimed it sat. It meant the line ran 60 feet north of where they thought, and that the strip of ground they were fining me for crossing was not theirs at all. And it meant something worse for them, something I sat with for a long while before I let myself believe it. If the north tier of lots was platted 60 feet into ground that the master deed never actually conveyed to the development, then the legal description of every lot that traced back to that point of beginning was defective. Not my fence. Their subdivision. I did not feel triumph. I want to be honest about that, because the easy version of this story is that I went home and laughed. I did not. I had a 15-year-old asleep in a house on land my grandfather recorded, and I had just learned that the people fining me $12 a day had built 81 homes on a survey that would not survive a careful reading. And the first thing I felt was the weight of how many ordinary families lived in those houses with no idea their lot lines were drawn from a mistake. The Frawleys had made the mistake. The Frawleys would answer for it. The houses, though, were full of people who had only wanted somewhere to live. So I did not run to the courthouse counter and announce it. I drove home, I made supper, and I went back to the folder, because I had learned long ago that being right is not the same as being able to prove it, and a survey error you cannot document is just an opinion. Over the next weeks, I built the proof the way I would build it for any client. I pulled the chain of title on the Pratt place back to the original conveyance. I pulled my grandfather's recorded deed and the corner record that went with it. I went out to the county road myself with my own instrument on a cold, clear morning with frost still in the shade, and I walked the ditch line reading the old descriptions out of a notebook against what was actually in the ground. The record said the stone corner sat a chain and a half east of where a long-gone fence once met the road. I pasted. I cut back a clump of sumac with a handsaw, and under the sumac, half-sunk-in sod and ringed with the rust of an old wire that had grown into nothing, was my grandfather's stone. I knelt down and brushed the top of it clean with my glove, and the drill marks were still there. The shallow cross he had cut to mark it 90 years before, the same mark I had been taught to cut by my father, who had been taught by him. I set up my tripod over that stone, and I shot the line. And the line told me what the records had already told me. The development's recorded boundary was 60 feet north of the deed. I photographed the stone with a folding rule laid across it for scale. I photographed the instrument readings. I drew it all on a clean plat in my own hand at the kitchen table that night, the error laid over the true line in 2 colors of pencil so a person who had never read a plat could see the gap, and I put the whole thing in the folder, and the folder was getting thick now. While I worked, the fine ran, $12 a day, every day, and Delia made sure I knew it, A new letter came each month with the running total at the top, and each one I dated and filed. By midsummer, the letter said I owed the association more than $2,000, and that a lien would be placed against my property if the balance was not paid and the fence not moved. A lien against 40 acres my grandfather recorded in 1934. I read that word, and I felt the old heat come up in my chest. And I did what I always do with the heat, which is to write down a date and let the paper carry it instead of my mouth. It was around then that I learned the rest of it, the part that turned a survey error into a reason. I was at the feed store one Saturday, loading mineral blocks into the bed of my truck, and a man I knew named Pete Halverson, who ran cattle on the far side of the development, leaned on my tailgate and asked if I had heard what Glenn Frawley was up to. I said I had not. Pete pushed his cap back and told it the way men tell things at a feed store, sideways and in no hurry. He said Glenn had filed for a second phase, Stonecrest Meadows North, another 60 lots up the rise. He said the survey crew had been out staking the entrance for a week. He said his brother-in-law worked at the bank in town and had let slip that the second phase money was hung up, that the bank would not release the construction loan until the developer showed clean title on the north boundary of the existing phase. Something about the line not being settled, Pete said. You'd know more about that than me. You're the line man. He did not know what any of it meant. I did. It meant that the strip of ground Delia was fining me over was the strip Glenn needed to build his second phase, and that the fence she wanted moved was standing exactly where the new road had to go. I thanked Pete, and I drove home with the mineral blocks shifting in the bed, and I did not say another word the whole way, because the fine was never about a fence. The fine was about 60 feet of ground worth more than $2,000 a day, to a man whose bank would not lend until the line was clean. That was the thing I had been missing, and once I had it, the whole pattern made sense. The letters about my roof and my brush pile had been Delia establishing a habit of authority, building a record of compliance she could point to later. The fence fine was the move that mattered. They needed the strip. They had decided the cheapest way to get it was to assert it was theirs, fine me until I gave up, and roll the fence north before anyone checked the deed. They were betting that an old man alone on 40 acres would not fight a homeowners association with a lawyer on retainer. They had not checked the deed. They had not checked the corner. They had not checked who I was. I did not tell Hazel everything, but I told her enough, because she had asked the right question 2 years before, and she deserved to see the answer. One evening I spread the plats on the kitchen table, and I showed her the stone corner and the wrong pin and the 60 feet, and I showed her how the error rolled through the whole subdivision. And she was quiet for a while, the way she gets. And then she said, so their houses are on our family's mistake-free line, and they're the ones who messed up. I told her that was about the size of it. She thought some more, and said, are you going to tell them? And I said, not yet. First, I'm going to let them tell everyone what they think is true. Then, I'm going to show what is true. In front of people who matter. She nodded, like that made sense to her, and it did. Because a thing said in your kitchen changes nothing, and a thing proven in a public room changes everything. The chance came in the fall. The County Planning Commission held a hearing on the application for Stonecrest Meadows North, the second phase, and the hearing was public, and the law required that adjoining landowners be notified, and I was an adjoining landowner. I got my notice in the mail, dated and filed like everything else, and I marked the evening on the calendar, and I told Hazel to wear something nice because we were going to a meeting. The hearing was in the county building, in a room with a long bench where the 5 commissioners sat, and a podium where the public spoke, and 40 folding chairs that were most of the way full when we got there. The air had the church basement smell of burnt coffee and floor wax. Glenn Frawley was at a table up front with a lawyer and a stack of boards on easels showing the new phase, the lots colored in pale green, the clubhouse, the entrance road curving in off the county road along the north boundary. Delia was in the front row, in a blazer, the color of a traffic cone, and she had her clipboard on her knee, and a string of pearls, and a pair of sunglasses pushed up into her hair, though the sun had been down an hour. When she saw me come in with Hazel, she leaned to the woman next to her and said something behind her hand, and the woman turned and looked at me, and I knew the look. It was the look of someone who has been told a story about a difficult old man who will not move his fence. I gave her a small nod, the kind you give a stranger, and I took Hazel to the back row and sat down with a folder squared on my knees. Hazel sat beside me. We listened to the whole presentation. Glenn's lawyer talked about the economic benefit to the county, the new homes, the tax base. Glenn stood and talked about his vision for the community. And then Delia, who was not on the application but could not help herself, asked the chairman if she could speak to the character of the development, and he said she could, and she went to the podium, and she said the thing that I had been waiting 5 years to have her say in front of people who could check it. Stonecrest Meadows, she said, has always maintained the highest standards along all of our boundaries. The only impediment to this beautiful next phase is a single adjacent property owner who has refused for years to bring his encroaching fence into compliance with our recorded plat. That parcel is functionally part of our community's northern edge, and his refusal is holding back progress for everyone. Functionally part of our community's northern edge. I had heard her say versions of it on my gravel and read it in her letters, but to hear her say it into a microphone to a county commission, with a court reporter taking it down, was the moment I had been patient for. She had committed, in the public record, to the claim that my land was hers and that her plat was correct. Now there was something to disprove. The chairman asked if any adjacent owners wished to be heard. I stood up. I left the folder closed, and I walked to the podium with 3 sheets of paper in my hand, and I gave my name, and I said I was the adjoining owner to the north, and that I was a licensed land surveyor with 31 years in the county. And I watched Glenn Frawley's lawyer sit up a little straighter at that last part, because a lawyer hears the word surveyor the way a sailor hears a change in the wind. I did not make a speech. I had promised myself I would not. And I had promised Hazel. And I have told you the protagonist in these stories never makes a speech, and that is true, and I will tell you why. A speech is an argument. A document cannot be argued with. So I said only this. I said that before the commission approved any phase platted from the existing subdivision's point of beginning, it might want to confirm where that point of beginning actually was. And I laid the first sheet on the podium and asked that it be entered into the record. It was the original recorded plat of Stonecrest Meadows with the surveyor's certificate showing the point of beginning called as the Stone Corner recorded in 1934. I laid down the second sheet. It was my grandfather's recorded deed and the county corner record for that same stone showing its true location. And I laid down the third sheet, the one I had drawn in my own hand, the true line and the platted line, laid one over the other, with the 60 feet between them measured and labeled, and the strip of ground the second phase needed sitting squarely in the gap. The room was quiet. The county surveyor, a man named Art Mendel, who had sat at the end of the commission bench all night saying nothing, leaned forward and pulled the third sheet toward him and looked at it for a long time. Then he looked at the recorded plat. Then he asked me one question, and it was the only question that mattered. "You found the original stone? The 34 corner?" "It's still in the ground," I said. "The drill marks are still in the top of it. I set up over it last month." Art Mendel sat back. He took off his glasses. And he said to the chairman, not to me, in the flat voice of a man, stating a fact he wishes were not true, "If that's the recorded corner, and it's where he says it is, then this subdivision's point of beginning is wrong, and every lot description in it traces back to a defective survey. We can't approve a second phase off that plat. We can't approve anything off that plat until it's resurveyed and the existing lots are corrected. This is going to have to go to the county attorney." I want to describe the next few seconds carefully because they are the reason people watch a thing like this through to the end. Delia Frawley stood up from the front row. She still had the clipboard. She said the commission did not understand that the fence was the problem, that the man at the podium was the one in violation, and the chairman, who was not unkind, told her gently to sit down, that the matter was now larger than her fence, and that she would want to speak to the developers' council before she said anything further into the record. Glenn Frawley did not stand at all. He sat at his table with his vision boards on their easels behind him, and he put his hand over his mouth. And he was not looking at me. He was looking at the third sheet of paper, the one in his own surveyor's lines. And I think that was the moment he understood that he had built 81 houses on a corner 60 feet north of where the law put it, and that he had spent the last 6 months trying to find the one man in the county who could prove it. I gathered my 3 sheets. I did not say anything else. There was nothing else that needed saying, and Hazel and I drove home in the dark, and she was quiet most of the way. And then near our road she said, "You didn't even raise your voice." And I said, "Didn't need to." That is the closest I came to a victory lap, and I said it to my daughter, not to them. Here are the 2 numbers I want you to hold against each other, because they are the whole case in 2 figures. In 6 months, the Stonecrest Meadows Homeowners Association had assessed me $12 a day, a fine that had grown past $2,000 for a fence that stood on my own ground. And in 90 years, the number of times my grandfather's recorded corner had moved was 0. Their fine ran. My corner held. One of those is a number that survives a courthouse, and one is not. What happened after happened, the way these things happen, slowly and then all at once. The county attorney opened a file. The second phase died on the table that night and never came back because a bank does not lend on title that cannot be cleared, and the title could not be cleared without a resurvey that would show the whole development sitting 60 feet north of its deed. Glenn Frawley's company had borrowed against the second phase before it was approved, the way overconfident men do. And when the phase collapsed, the loan came due, and within the year the company that had platted Stonecrest Meadows was insolvent. The strip of ground Delia had fined me over, the strip Glenn needed for his road, was found by the county's resurvey to belong, as it always had, to my 40 acres, recorded in 1934. They lost the subdivision. The whole development had to be resurveyed and every one of those 81 deeds corrected at the developer's expense. And it was the developer's own filing, his own application for more, that had brought the record into a room with a county surveyor in it. The flood they built fell on their own house. I never had to push it. I only had to hold still and let them walk into the one room where the truth was already waiting in the public record. The fine against me was voided. The lien was never filed. The association sent no more letters, because the association's authority had been built on the assumption that its plat was correct, and once the plat was known to be wrong, the whole structure of fines and standards and compliance walkthroughs lost the ground it stood on. Delia Frawley resigned as president that winter. I take no pleasure in that part, and I will not pretend to. She lost the thing she had built her sense of herself on, and she lost it because she would not check a corner. And there is a hard lesson in that for all of us, myself included. Some of the neighbors came around after. A few of them stopped at my gate. The same gate, Ruth, made me move twice, and a couple of them apologized for things they had thought about me. And one woman cried a little because she was afraid for her own deed. Her name was Carol, and she lived in the second house from the corner, and she stood at my gate twisting her car keys and asked me straight out if she was going to lose her home. I told her the truth, which was that the resurvey would fix her lot and cost her nothing, and that her house was not going anywhere, that the only deeds in trouble were the ones the developer had drawn from the bad corner, and that the county would correct them on the developer's dime. She asked how I could be so sure. I walked her down the fence line to where she could see the oak at the top of the rise, and I told her my grandfather had recorded that corner in 1934, and that it had never moved, and never would, and that her house sat on solid ground even if the paper describing it needed fixing. She left calmer than she came. A man named Russ brought me a pie his wife had made, and stood on the gravel not knowing what to say, and finally said he had voted for the fence fines at a meeting once and wished he hadn't, and I told him to forget it, that he had voted on a map he had been handed and had no reason to doubt. They had been told a story about a difficult old man, and the story had not been true, and most of them were decent enough to want to know that. Hazel is 16 now. She came with me last month when I went back out to the stone corner to clear the sumac off it so it would not be lost again, and she watched me brush the dirt out of my grandfather's 90-year-old drill marks, and she asked if she could feel them. And she put her fingers in the little marks the way she once put her finger on a letter and asked if they could do that. I told her this corner was here before the subdivision, and it would be here after, and that it had not moved, and that nothing built on a guess can stand against something recorded true. She has decided she wants to study surveying. I did not push her toward it. The corner did that. So here is the lesson, and it is the reason I told you all of this, instead of keeping it to myself. If an association, a board, a developer, or any clipboard with a logo tells you that your land is functionally theirs, do not argue with them. Go to the courthouse. Pull the recorded plat that their authority traces back to, and pull your own deed, and pull the corner records, and read all three against the ground itself. Find the original corner. Walk your own line. Keep a folder, and put a date on every piece of paper they hand you, and never raise your voice, because the quietest thing in any dispute is a recorded document, and the document does not get tired. They are betting you will not check. Check. The deed older than the claim wins every time, but only for the owner who can lay it on the table. If you have stood at your own fence line with a stranger telling you it is not yours, I would like to hear how you handled it, so leave it below. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one, because there is always a next one. Next time I will tell you about a man who was fined for the dock on a lake his family had deeded water rights to, since before the lake had a homeowners association, and what happened the summer the association tried to charge him to use his own water. Until then, keep your records, walk your lines, and find your corner before someone else tells you where it is.